we want to start with something that Dilman Dila wrote in 2015, and it's called "Is Science Fiction Really Alien to Africa?" And this can give us a bit of an introduction into the topic, and I think that Tendai will be reading it, right?
Yeah, I'll read it. Thanks for that awesome introduction, Peter. You almost make me sound like a decent writer. Thank you all for coming in today. I would much rather be out in the sunshine, but hey, we've all got our own fetishes. So I'll read this wonderful piece on behalf of Dilman. And I think it was prescient that you chose this particular piece because it says a lot about what we're doing today and even the situation that he's not here. So just imagine me as a Ugandan dude for a second.
There's a picture.
Yeah. African writers are traumatized. They forever have to defend their work. If it's not someone questioning why they're not tackling the problems of their societies, it's someone wondering why they only write about misery and gloom in the continent. When they discover that African writers are churning out stuff like speculative fiction, they say copycat, or something worse. The something worse happened to me. Shortly after my book came out, a Ugandan living in the UK asked, "Are you really Ugandan? Surely you didn't grow up in Uganda. No one who grew up in Uganda can write such stories." I stopped responding. In recent years, there's been a burst of activity with regards to SFF in Africa. Some liken it to Afrofuturism, but I don't like that idea. For African Americans operate in a slightly different world. I prefer the term AfroSF, Afro-horror, Afro-fantasy, etc., or African SFF, so as to market products that are from within the continent. African Americans and Africans in the diaspora, though disadvantaged compared to their siblings from other mother whites, enjoy a richer pool of resources and opportunities compared to us who work and live in the continent. See, the Kane Prize, which is one of the leading prizes for African fiction, is often dominated by people in the diaspora. In writing this article, I wanted to add my voice to those who stress that sci-fi is not alien to Africa. Why? At this early stage, we're trying to win an audience. Thus, talk of Afro-SFF being a mimic can put readers off. True, some stories are imitative of popular Western films and books. We can't ignore that influence. It would be hypocrisy. I often cite Stephen King and Margaret Atwood as having big influences on my work. I wrote one of the stories in A Killing in the Sun, The Yellow People, right after reading The Tommyknockers. When I started to read Lauren Buke's Zoo City, I at first thought of Philip Pullman's Northern Lights. But after the first page, that comparison stopped, for I was lost in an alternate Johannesburg with a fascinating heroine and her sloth. So if anyone is to look at the surface and not go into detail to appreciate the characters and the worlds we create, that person is doing us a disservice. A recent article even went so far as to claim that when we create superheroes, we are merely copying X-Men and Superman, and that we should invent something unique in the same way Western sci-fi has the ray gun. But this article forgets that our works are only starting to come out and they did not hit the popularity levels of Western or even Asian products. With time, our creations will be part of the popular culture, but we won't get there if myopic detractors keep nibbling at our efforts. The simple fact is that human stories have always been speculative stories. Branding such as sci-fi or fantasy or literary is a recent phenomenon. It probably came about with capitalism as the volume of written works grew and publishers needed a way of selling to various readers. African societies are not unique. They too told sci-fi stories. I'll cite an example of are called folk tales. These stories do not use magic or the supernatural, but feature technology that does not exist in the world of the characters. This, I believe, is ultimately what makes a story sci-fi. In both, Hare is the hero. In the one that I love, the king sends his best and strongest warriors to bring Hare to justice over some mischief. Warriors like Elephant, surely mighty Elephant would have no trouble beating Hare, but Hare devised a weapon. I think a gourd with fake brains stuffed in it. When it stuck Elephant's head, the fake brains stuck to Elephant. It must have caused Elephant enough pain that when Hare said, "Look, I've smashed your head and your brains are hanging out," Elephant believed and fled before Hare could do more harm. The other story has the village digging a well, but Hare refuses to participate. To punish him, they send guards to watch the well and ensure he doesn't drink from it. Hare gets into a calabash, which he modifies so he can hide in it and roll in it. In a way, it was some kind of vehicle. He then comes rolling towards the well while singing, "Oh, people of the well, let me drink water." The god amplifies his voice until it sounds like he is a terrible ghost. When the guards hear this, they flee, and Hare gets his drink. But of course, these tales were not labeled as sci-fi. But in writing stories like How My Father Became a God, in which an African scientist living at a time before Europeans arrived invents a super weapon, I am not thinking about all the cool weapons like ray guns and heat guns. I am simply thinking of this crafty Mr. Hare, as I remembered from my grandmother.
That was awesome. Thanks. So, Tendai, to get our conversation started, Dilman addresses so many things in this short post. The African speculative fiction upsurge, the writing conditions on the continent, Afrofuturism, literary influences and prejudice. And maybe we can just start from the very beginning. So what exactly happened with this upsurge, and what was the situation in publishing African science fiction before that?
Okay, where to even begin? Talk about a first question, Peter. I think now, okay, so when you hear stuff about African sci-fi and this upsurge that is going on, it it sounds great, but I come into it as a bit of a cynic, right? If I think about, say, if you just go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? It was almost then impossible to get anything published, particularly in the West as an African writer in this particular genre. And one of the most interesting experiences for me, having come to Germany multiple times and speaking with German writers, they'll tell you a very similar story, right? In which it is very difficult to get published in the Anglophone world. I was down in the dealers market. It's damn near impossible to get an English SFF book by a German author for me, right? Because that market would then, they'll tell you stuff like, no one buys this stuff, we've got our own material, it doesn't sell. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because you don't go into Waterstones in Scotland where I live and get this German fiction. It doesn't exist, and therefore it doesn't sell. And they use the same narrative for writers from the African continent. And I always look at this thing through a capitalist lens. I have the simple truism. It's like if you're doing crime fiction, which I dabble in, right? Just follow the money. Who gets paid? And the way the publishing market in the Anglophone world is structured is that the money should always flow to the UK or the States in terms of selling rights and things like that. They're not really interested in anyone else. So when I think about authors like, say, N.K. Jemisin, multiple award winner, her first couple of books, if I recall correctly, and someone might correct me if I'm mistaken, were actually written with white characters because, again, she was told this stuff doesn't sell, right? Flash forward now, there have been a few sort of like structural changes, etc., and you are getting more stuff published from, African writers, etc., that kind of thing, and it's good. I mean, this is my work, this is what I do. It's great for me. But then I look at it and then say, okay, is this a moment? Is this something happening? Or we're merely seeing an area that was suppressed and now you're beginning to sell, and they clap themselves on the back and say, oh, we're doing this is diversity, this is wonderful, how awesome we are. But if you're working within it, you also have this keen awareness that, for example, I get published by fairly decent label Talk. They only let so many in, and then they'll say, oh, we've got Tendai, which you hear, we're diverse, we're wonderful, which is great if you're me and you're the beneficiary of that. But then there'll be a lot of writers for whom the door gets shut. So I don't necessarily celebrate the moment in that same sense, because I think there's a lot of great writers out there whose work we could be enjoying that, but we don't see. And so this thing that we're in, if you have been in it for as long as I have been, it is not a meritocracy by any measure.
So, so why did they let at least a couple of people in now? What do you think happened there? Is there something we can point at, or is it really the suppressed mark that broke out?
It's always a little bit difficult to pinpoint, right? So if I'm thinking of the first sort of like early works that came to my attention within the particular genre, and I'll say this from my own personal experience, right? When you are writing or engaged in any art form, especially if you're going sort of like the traditional mainstream way, and this is not to disrespect anyone who self-publishes. In fact, I think self-publishing is a great thing and a fantastic phenomenon. I just don't have the skills. You need a much wider skill set because you handle far many more aspects of the publishing. You are a one-man publisher, and that is something that is very difficult, and I don't have the skills for that. But when you are working within this sort of like commercialized space, you are likely to be attracted to areas where the opportunities lie, right? So I'll say this: that there is a reason why probably every footballer on the globe wants to play in Europe, right? Because that's where the action is, that's where the resources are, etc., etc. And some of the people that maybe are really good footballers might be, I don't know, excellent, what kind of mediocre sport, curlers or stuff like that. But they turn their attention to this thing because that's where the opportunities lie. And writers are pretty much like that. So before you start seeing writers like Nedi Okorofa and Lauren Bukes, there is nothing really there. And you do have this awareness that even if I do stuff in this particular genre, I'm not going to find a home for it. I'm going to get knocked back for it. So those two kind of become visible. But there's this dude called Ivo Hartman, who's a Zimbabwean dude who now lives in Sweden. And he kicks off the AfroSF anthology, right? And so I'd always had this intention, because for me as a reader, you cut your teeth as a young kid reading like SFF and choose your own adventure books, your Nancy Drews, your crimes and stuff like that. I'd always had the intention to work in there, but it's something that I thought would happen much later in my career. Ivo comes along and he says, look, I'm doing this anthology. Would you like to contribute a piece? I say, yes, yeah, I'll do it. He does AfroSF. It kind of takes off, and there's all these people kind of talking about it. And so he pretty much curates a list of writers that, a number of whom are still working today. And it becomes a thing, and there's interest. And there's also people that are kind of like emerging outside of this that are interested in this thing that's happening and in this genre. And you're not getting like, because this starts off in the short fiction market, you're also getting African writers getting published at the time in sort of like these interesting Western publications like Lightspeed, FNSF, that kind of thing. And so you get this momentum that's starting to gather. And that really, I think for me, the pinnacle is when Mazi and Chinelo Onwalu establish Omenana magazine, which is a fantastic sort of like African sci-fi magazine based in Nigeria. And now all of a sudden you have this home for these people that are creating these things. Because again, before this moment, when you send your work out there, it might be knocked back for reasons that are not to do with the quality of the work, if it's suitable, but it might just be to do with the editor's prejudices. But there's a lot more people working in this particular area. But I think it also kind of intersects with the historical moment in which we live in. Having started out in mainstream fiction myself, and sort of seeing other authors from the continent move into this area. I was saying earlier in our conversation today that the world that we live in is already a sci-fi world. It is, and of course we are always drawn to the fantastic because the fantastic is our original attempt to understand the world that we live in, right? But because the world is set up that way, there's a lot more people coming into this particular genre and they're getting published, and eventually it becomes a thing. And when something becomes a thing, what happens to these publishers that were saying, oh, we don't publish this because we can't sell it? They want to monetize it. And then all these people kind of end up getting caught up in this thing where we now feed the machine with the stories that we tell. It's in effect, you sell your soul to the devil, pretty much. There have been attempts like, I think there was a South African imprint that tried to do a sci-fi thing in the early days, but they didn't last long. So a lot of it is also tied with African publishing, particularly in Anglophone Africa, is pretty tied to the Western presses because the state of the market itself within Africa is problematic. But that's a whole sort of like different conversation. So there's a coalescing of different things until we have this moment and it becomes a thing. Yeah.
So we're going to talk a bit more about your work later on, but I want to ask, like, connecting to what you just said, you said that you thought you would write sci-fi later on in your career. Why is that?
Well, at the time, I have all these sort of like different interests. So, for example, for my own writing practice, I'd always bifurcated fiction into these different strands. So if I try out crime, I'm leaning heavily on plotting and elements to do with plotting. If I'm doing SFF, then it's world building and stuff like that. If I'm doing literary fiction, then it's character work. And this isn't to say these things are exclusive or denoted like that, but there's different muscles that you're working out then. But my thought had been at the time when I started out, like, look, I would have to build a name and a reputation in something else and then eventually get to do the stuff that I want to do. The irony, though, is publishers don't like that. So by the time I did The Hairdresser of Farah, it was like, yeah, we're doing very well with this. We should keep on doing this thing. And I also understand it from a commercial perspective, because if I picked up, say, a John Grisham novel, and it turned out to be a space opera, I would be very, very disappointed, right? So, you want the reader to have something that they recognize. And this is also one of the reasons why I ended up having this bifurcation for publishing this stuff as TL Huchu and the other stuff as Tendai Huchu. But it was mainly to do with, I felt I needed to create the space to be able to do the work. And even when I came into the SFF scene, I spent a long time sort of like trying to, doing my short fiction and stuff. So you wouldn't be one of those asshole literary writers who come in and say, oh, this is easy, this is just a thing I'm going to do, because that is pretty disrespectful. And I'm thinking of one particular writer who's done this, who's a British writer, but you end up just creating crap because you don't know what's going on in the genre that you're working in. So the whole thing for writing for me is you almost have to think in these long time scales, and 5 years, 10 years time, because it takes a while for that tip of the iceberg to pop up. Yeah.
So another question that kind of ties into what you were just saying is you emphasize short fiction. Short fiction is like the lifeblood of African science fiction at this moment. So would you say that's, if I'm mischaracterizing, then call me out. But why what is the function of why is short fiction so important to African sci-fi? And sci-fi, when I say sci-fi, I mean anything speculative or whatever. I mean it in the broadest sense.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I use short fiction as my R&D department. When I want to experiment with voice and styles and things like that, that is, instead of doing the marathon of a novel, you can kind of do it in a shorter work. I mean, the Library of the Dead, the series starts as a short story called Ghost Stoker, which I then liked the character and expanded on it. But for writers working on the continent, certainly the ones that I've met, I was at the Ake Festival last year in Nigeria, and you get to meet a lot of writers, and the circumstances in which you're working are different. I mean, the novel is a long-term commitment that also there is no guarantee of a reward at the end of it. And if you're starting out, short fiction is the best thing you want to start out in. So the Kane Prize that Dilman mentioned is a short fiction prize, which is kind of their leading prize on the African continent. And so a lot of writers are kind of drawn to that. You cut your teeth in short fiction, which I did it the other way around. I started in the novel and then moved towards short fiction. But I think to start within the shorter form is maybe the best thing. You also get the gratification of getting something out there or working with editors and other people at an earlier stage in your career than you might do if you just go for a novel straight away. So there's all these practitioners that, a lot of the people they rate are people that cut their teeth in short fiction as well. So it almost becomes a thing. And if I think of, some of the African short fiction SFF writers that are publishing later on this year, whose work I want to read, and some of them I've read their arcs, they all pretty much universally come from that short fiction tradition. Yeah.
So short fiction as like a pre-stage of what's to come in a sense, possibly.
Yeah, and as well, it's a space where there are opportunities because you've got Omenana, you've got Kalahari, you've got the Johannesburg Review of Books, and you've got this ecosystem of these and you've got a lot of anthologizing as well from the African continent, and so there's opportunities that already exist in this space, and I think that encourages creativity in that particular direction.
To talk more generally about African science fiction, is there something? So when we talk about this thing called African science fiction, can we like nail it down? Can we say what is African science fiction exactly? Is there a generic difference, or how should we see this term, this category?
Oh bloody hell! Now you ask me.
Sorry.
I tend to be deeply kind of suspicious of things that have an ethnic marker, right? This has been like a big debate in quote unquote African fiction, for lack of a better word. You're looking at right. If you think of, I don't know if anyone knows that there's a Zimbabwean writer Dambudzo Marichera, who had this thing. I think he said something like, "If you're a writer for a specific nation or race, then fuck you. Either you're a writer or you're not a writer." But these labels, I think they're again a product of this market and this ecosystem that we're in, because I feel if you read a particular text purely because it's LGBTQ, I mean we are obsessed with identities now, aren't we? It's LGBTQ or it's African or it's this or it's that. I think you miss an awful lot of what the author is trying to do. And if in the African thing, if you think about how diverse that continent is, people think of it as just one thing, like it's I've been to Africa. What do you mean? I've had instances in the past where you meet someone and then they ask you random questions like, "Oh, do you know so and so from Tanzania?" Like, do you know so and so from Croatia? How does that work? But I also understand its utility in terms of a marketing thing as well. So you are caught up in this ambivalent space in which you think, yeah, this is bullshit a little bit, but it creates certain opportunities that otherwise might not exist. But the hope for me is by generating more work, we then move into a space in which you know the writers are kind of recognized not only for their nationalities but as unique individuals doing like cool, brilliant stuff. Yeah.
So, as this debate about African science fiction went on, there were a whole bunch of people who started criticizing the way that we were talking about that others were talking about it. One example is Tade Thompson. He said at some point that we should stop talking about the rise of African science fiction. And another example was Chinelo Nwalu, who is the co-founder of Omena now. And she at some point said that, and I quote here now, nearly every article on African speculative fiction that I've read starts with an air of surprise and discovery. The author never knew the genre existed and is delighted by what they have found. And while she also recognizes that something did happen in 2008, that there was actually a boom in African sci-fi, she concludes, frankly, I am tired of such articles. I wanted to ask you, what do you make of this position and the position that they're criticizing?
Yeah, some of these conversations within the scene, they do, if you're living it does get a little tedious when you encounter it and you're like, yeah, I get exactly what they're saying, right? But I trust the origins of this to kind of imperialism, right? You go to places and you discover people, otherwise they don't exist. So it's, again, if if a writer is working somewhere in Africa and people they know him, and you discover now they're kind of legit, because before they were that tree that falls in the forest that if people in the West don't hear it, then it hasn't happened, right? It's a philosophical sort of like conundrum, and then you get that blessing from the West, and you're now like you're the real deal. I, I think it speaks more to sort of like power relations more than anything as well. It is to say, in the West, we're the guys that make things happen, and if we see your stuff, therefore, it's now pretty much legit. And I tend to struggle with those, particularly, what Chinelo and Tade are saying is, if you're on that scene and you know what's going on in African sci-fi, you're like, "Oh, you haven't discovered anything." But um, I've also got an interest in African crime, and I remember this time being commissioned to do a piece by an editor for a magazine that I shall not name about these crime writers that I love. I wrote the piece. The editor moved on before I'd completed the piece, and I was passed on to another editor. And her first thing to me when she got a hold of it was, "Oh yeah, can you tell us, why American writers would want to read this?" At which point I was just like, I give up. I'll take my article elsewhere, because it's just so exhausting trying to justify the thing. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So when we think about African science fiction, there's a bunch of texts I want to say that we can connect to this moment of discovery. We have okay, these are like the early ones. So Lara Bukes' Moxieland, and then District 9, and Pumzi by Benoit Cahill.
This is also sort of like 2007, 8, 9,
Yeah,
thereabouts. Yeah.
yeah. So this is 899 exactly. Yeah.
All right.
And then at some point also, and I would say this is probably the moment of discovery for many people, Black Panther comes along. So could you say something about maybe the importance of both of these moments? You already kind of addressed Pumzi and so on, and then also Black Panther, and how are they the same, or how are they different?
Um, I don't know. It's at least with sort of like District 9 and Pumzi, there's the end of creators that are from the African continent. I tend to kind of view Black Panther a little differently, um, in the sense that it is a Marvel product, right? But when I look at this whole thing, and and I think about sort of just segueing into Marvel. Their first sort of like mainstream hero was like Blade, right? And then you have this long period before you get to Black Panther, and I think that that says a lot. But one thing I would agree on, especially when we're talking about writing on the continent, those works and their visibility really did a lot to kind of stir people up and to say, yeah, we're gonna start working in this space. It's almost like you need the spark to ignite it. And this is, again, isn't to say that there aren't works from earlier on that dealt with some of these themes, but you might find the writers then were labeled literary writers because that is the label that you'd have to occupy if you're a writer from the continent. But those were definitely key works. I really view Black Panther and that whole Marvel phenomena as something different because, again, I still have this thing where it's like follow the money. So I'm always skeptical, especially this age that we live in, and you know, say for example, the things that kind of annoy us all, right? We're gonna get a new Harry Potter, the Lord of the Rings. We're probably gonna have another Lord of the Rings in 10 years' time, and that kind of thing. And it's when I see those, I have an innate understanding that look, they're not gonna take my work or someone else's work because that's a creator that you then have to pay, right? If it pays off. But you can keep recycling these works and at least select these. But you can still stand up and say we're doing diversity because we've now turned Hermione into a curly-haired black woman. So how wonderful we are! And it's a game that they play that is kind of exhausting to see play out. But it has a life and a momentum on its own. But always, when you look at these works, ask yourself who's bankrolling this and who's getting what from it. Yeah.
One term that really got into, I want to say, the public realm again prominently was the term Afrofuturism. Do you think this is a useful term to think about African science fiction, African speculative fiction? What are your thoughts?
So Afrofuturism for me is an interesting term coined by Mike Derry, I think.
Mark Derry. Yeah.
Mark Derry, an white American dude who was looking at sort of like Sun Ra and Octavia Butler and all these African American artists doing something, right? And he kind of coins this term, but even in his first conception of it, it's sort of like the idea of Black people or people of African descent in the future, which, if you're an American, is a pretty radical idea. Right? How could that even be possible? So even then, in his definition of it, I don't know if anyone was in the Ghost in the Shell thing, but William Gibson would be an Afrofuturist. It's just you just have to tack in a black character in the future, and you're an Afrofuturist. So it's a pretty open term that way. It obviously morphs and changes over time. But for me, being from Africa, I can't even imagine a future without Africans in it. So it's one of those terms that, again, there's this sort of like collective lumping together that happens, that you end up finding yourself in a movement because, I don't know, some academic has decided that, okay, we're just going to fit all these people into one thing because that's the term that exists. So you now find the writer Lady Okorofa, who came up with her own version, which is African futurism or African Jujuism, in that it centers stuff that is coming from Africa and African sensibilities, as opposed to what's going on in the diaspora. But definitionally, at this point, you kind of start splitting hairs because a lot of the practitioners working within that area wouldn't necessarily define themselves as such, but you find yourself lumped into this movement for good or ill. So I tend to be deeply skeptical about these classifications and stuff, and it's maybe because I don't come from an academic background. Certainly in terms of your own practice as a writer, If you're writing about space, right, you put an ethnic marker there. Does it really change the true nature of the story? I don't think it does. Yeah.
Do you see something that does change the true nature of the story? Like, are there like examples of texts or projects that you think, yeah, this is really trying to do something that we haven't seen before, maybe?
I think that kind of change comes from the individual creator. So my own sort of like style and sensibility is more never reinventing the wheel. I'm the kind of writer who will use cliches even though you're told don't use cliches. I'm kind of contrarian in that sense, but I believe that they contain some sort of like the linguistic genius of the culture that has spawned. And that's my method of working. But I think where you find sort of like the differences, it can only be down to an individual creator. There's a Nigerian writer who's had her first novel published this year called Dazzling that I absolutely adore, Chikodili Melumadu. She does this weird, hard to pin down, and she hates the label horror, even though her stories are, in my opinion, pretty horrific at most. But it's in a use of language. It's in the quirkiness of the characters that she creates, in which I recognize her originality. That this is someone who is striving to do something particularly different. That she happens to be a woman and from Nigeria, for me, doesn't really factor into it, because as you are going through the text, in terms of her use of language, her plotting and stuff, you kind of sit there thinking, yeah, there is a huge V8 engine under the hood that is just consuming gallons of fuel. Um, and you come out of the experience of reading a work a little altered, and you're like, shit, okay, you can do that. That's pretty cool. But I don't think that is something that you necessarily get again from the identity markers that we really love holding on to. Yeah. So genius in terms of creating as a writer, um, has to come from the individual who is making the work, with the support obviously of their editors and other people that put a thumbprint on what you get at the end of the day.
So,
Chikodili is Chikodili, Emelumadu, Emelumadu, and the novel is called Dazzling, and it will dazzle you.
So you, as I said in the beginning, also don't exactly respect the boundaries of genre. You already kind of addressed this first. You started with a realist novel or literary fiction, however you want to call it, and I really wonder how the hell you convinced your publishers all of a sudden to publish something completely different after that. But also within your books, I sometimes think actively kick against the borders boundaries of genre. So, for example, The Library of the Dead that I already talked about could very easily be called a fantasy novel. It has this sort of fantasy, almost, I want to say Harry Pottery, but then not as problematic, flair to it. But then all of a sudden there's a book about magic that is being read out, and I'm quoting this here, in which quote, the magician is like the engineer who, through a thoroughly scientific understanding of the natural and supernatural work, shapes the world according to his will. End quote. So then all of a sudden you take this idea of fantasy not being scientific and you say, yeah, this is actually science.
Mhm.
And if we were to look even a bit further in that narrative world of the Library of the Dead, it's really unclear where exactly we are, or when we are for that matter. You do something with time there that we could probably call post-apocalyptic, probably not. Could you say something about how exactly this works and what the function of genre is at all, or if at all?
Okay, so one thing I've always tried to do, I see genre as something that's crucial in the writer's toolkit, right? It's these pre-existing narratological devices. So If you start off with a guy in an office with a whiskey bottle and it's dark and dingy, and this quote unquote broad walks in with a problem, you know it's noir. It's kind of like and you can springboard and do anything with that. You can subvert it, you can do whatever. And I've always been interested in this. So The Hairdresser of Harare, my first novel, borrows an awful lot of genre chick lit. But because I'm a guy, you have to take it seriously, because you must be saying something important about, I don't know, Zimbabwe, society, politics, and all that. The same novel with like a woman with a big afro with the same name set in a hair salon published by a female writer might not be received in the same way. So I become literary, even though the stuff that I'm springboarding off is to tell the story is genre chick lit. I didn't get to keep my publishers though, because for my second novel, I saw it as, and I won't go into it in detail, but as it was my take on a genre spy novel. The Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician is designed to be a spy novel masquerading as a literary novel. My publishers dumped me for that one because, again, I'd moved too far from this thing I was supposed to do. I'd been told many times, let's do a sequel to The Hairdresser. We did really well with this, and I had to find new publishers for that. Part of the bifurcation that I ended up making for my other stuff, to start using a sort of like a different name, was to say, okay, I might have to brand these things a little bit differently. But for me, the whole point of working within a genre is you've got these pre-existing building blocks that will say to someone, okay, you're coming into a world of the fantastic. But within that, you can start playing around with the ideas that interest you. So you mentioned something about the weird Edinburgh in the Library of the Dead. What I was trying to do then, apart from tell a story about ghosts and all this other stuff, was I was trying to find a different way of playing with time. So normally in novels, if an author is playing with time, you'll find there are these chronological leaps, right, between past and future, and the blurring of these lines and those kind of things. I was trying to do it with geography. So you've got the cityscape of the Edinburgh within the novel that is a blurring of sort of like the 18th century Edinburgh, which, Scotland was the poorest nation in Western Europe. It was a shithole country. And I bring back elements of that past, the present Edinburgh, and a slightly dystopian future. So you get things like electric vehicles moving next to horse-drawn carts. And it might seem a bit weird, but also remember the sensibility of where I'm coming from. If I can catch a flight, go to Harare right now, I'll be in a fairly modern city. I live the city 20 minutes away. There's still people doing subsistence farming in mud huts. But those same people have got smartphones and they're checking out weather patterns and doing all sorts of things on. So there's this juxtaposition that I'm kind of really interested in my creation of that particular Edinburgh and society. So some of these things might seem jarring to people, but if you walk around with your eyes open, they're already there in the world that we live in. I mean, we're having this conversation in a crematorium, for Christ's sake.
And the short stories that the novel came out of, if you will, they were originally set in Zimbabwe, weren't they?
Okay, yeah. So the process that happens is in 2015, I did a short story called Ghost Stalker for this e-zine called Electric Spec. So for those who know, it's sort of like the sci-fi short story market. You've got your pro-paying magazines, and then you've got your semi-pros, and then you've got your token or free market. And I had written the story about a young girl who plays the Mbira, talks to ghosts in my hometown, and ends a living, because we monetize everything, right? Mediums need to get paid too. And she had such a zingy voice and a personality. I was like, yeah, this is really dope, but I'd love to work with her again. Can she carry a novel? I didn't have the solution then. It was digesting. I did a second story called The Library of the Dead, which was Zimbabwe has this sort of like national hero saga where they bury the old guys that fought in the war and stuff like that. And I've always had this fascination with graveyards. I'm one of those weird people that likes entering these spaces, reading the inscriptions and trying to learn something about the people that lived in that particular era. So I was thinking of the dead and bodies and stuff, and these ritual spaces as a repository of memory. And as soon as I did that story, I knew that these two were set in the same sort of like universe. I wanted to do the novel originally in my hometown of Bindra, Zimbabwe, but it's a small mining town, and I needed a larger canvas to work on. So I chose the place that I know second best, which is Edinburgh. As soon as I did that, so you have these proto characters, but you now have to do a translation thing. So the language that they use changes. The magic system that I designed had to change. Creatively, it became like really, really interesting for me. I always say that there's like this sonic landscape that I'm trying to do where you've got these elements that are tugging against one another at all times, and that's deep within Ropa's own voice. But the main reason I chose Edinburgh then is, even though spatially it's not like a great big city, it has sort of like that temporal depth of its history that I could mine and appropriate, and I use that word deliberately, and start messing around with those. So I enjoy this kind of chaotic fusion of different things, because it reflects the reality of the world that we live in. Yeah.
And just for those of you who have not read it, you feel this tension, but then again, it doesn't distract from the reading, because the plot is so strong that it's pulling you forward, even though it's like pulling you sideways as well, by all those that contradiction. So I have like 50 more questions, but I think that we have only 11 more minutes left, and I think that maybe you also want to ask questions in the audience. So I think I want to open it up now, if that's okay for you.
I'm just shocked they're still awake.
I think it's those cookies downstairs. They have a lot of sugar. Yeah, so questions. I think I saw. Yeah.
Yes, actually. So I read this, The Library of the Dead. Do you think this is? We had actually this in our book group in Stockholm. We were discussing this book, The Library of the Dead, and we had a discussion if it was more horror or is it more YA? What do you think about it?
The categorization, it has elements of both. So you have this narrator with the Library of the Dead, and thank you for reading it. I think Stockholm seems to have great taste. So you have this narrator who is 14 going on 15, which should classify it as YA, but she's a breadwinner and doing like really adult things. And when I first envisaged her, right, I was like, okay, so we have this idea of what childhood is, but if you go back a generation or two, there was no such thing. I trained as a podiatrist, podologist. So anyone with a foot fetish, see me after this. And at the time, I would meet these old clients in Edinburgh, and they'll start, they'll sit in your chair and you're doing their feet, and they'll start telling you the most amazing stories. I went to work at 14 and stuff. Now, remember, I was a teenager until I was about 35. So it was shocking to me that these people were economically involved. But again, if you look around the world, they are economically active children everywhere, because they kind of have to fend for themselves and support the family. So I wanted that kind of reflected in the future that I was writing. And again, it's always kind of much more jarring when you put this stuff in a Western setting, right? So because of those older themes, it might work for the reader that's not necessarily YA. The horror element that you mentioned, that there are a few dodgy bits. I think it's the house at the lodge that, yeah, I had this nightmare where when I was writing the book, I went to this house. I was doing deliveries for some reason, and I got trapped in the house, and I had to work, and it was pretty shitty. And I ended up integrating that into the text. But again, for me as a writer, I know that there is this need to have the classification afterwards. But when you're doing the thing, a lot of it you're going with your gut and what feels right to that particular work. So it is very difficult to find any or to create something that is going to fit neatly into the box, because if you're going with the work that is so tricky, I would envy anyone who can pull something off that is definitively what they say it is on the shelf.
So you didn't write for a specific audience then, you just...
I went with the story. So when my agent was trying to find a publisher for it, we had interest from both children's publishers and adult publishers. So it could have gone either way. And part of me kind of wishes it had gone to a specific young adult publisher, because those kids who read it would have learned some new shit.
I saw another hand there, yeah.
I read the library on the net simultaneously while listening to the article, both in English, and the person who reads it is very, like, just does an awesome job with an accent and without depending on who's talking. Did you did you have a hand in that? Like, did you choose who's doing that and what accent? Because I mean, I don't know how Zimbabwean accent sounds in English. Is that what the reader is doing? Like, did you talk to the person? How did that happen?
Well, so this is the cool thing that happened then. When my publisher said we're doing an audiobook version, I was like, oh, okay. I even struggled doing readings of the book. I have to specifically curate to find passages that don't contain a lot of Scots words, because my pronunciation of those is crap as well. And they're like, yeah, we need to find an actress. So it was pretty clear you'd have to find someone who's able to do a Scottish accent. And they also wanted that Zimbabwean thing. But lo and behold, I don't know where they went, but they found this young actress called Tinashe Warikandwa, who was sort of like a young Zimbabwean. I think she was born in Scotland, but her dad's Zimbabwean, etc. So she has experience of both cultures. And I think she did a fantastic job with it. I've personally only listened to a few sections. They sent me samples of the work that she was doing, and when I heard it, I was like, yeah, that's her. But the problem is I have a different voice in my head that I hear when I'm writing, and it's so distinctive. It's a little bit different from the audio narration, and I always feared if I listen to the full narration that might alter the voice in my head. One of the biggest struggles for me now, as the series progresses, 3 books on, is switching the voice back on when I start writing. That I mean, for book 3, I almost thought the muses had abandoned me, because I'd go there, start typing, I'm like, yeah, this sounds like me, this doesn't sound like the character, what's happened to the character? And then you start getting a little bit neurotic because time is passing and you've got to deliver the damn thing, because now you have a contract for doing it. And eventually I got to it, but it was pretty brutal. And now I'm working on the 4th. And again, it was that process, because I imagine a few people here might be writers, but there is a thing that happens where you get locked into the tone of it. And if you read my emails that I correspond with people when I'm writing, they tend to not quite sound like me, but like the character. And it's always a relief when you're done with it and you're like, fuck it, I can leave this and be myself now.
I saw another question over there.
Yeah, so thank you for the amazing panel. I think I have 2 questions, but we only have 5 minutes and I try to keep it as short as possible. But I was extremely fascinated by the picture you painted of us all being extremely dependent on the English language book market. So I think my first question is there a Francophone African science fiction movement, and how would I find that? Because right now I really depend on the stuff that I think we all depend on the incomes via the US market. And the other question that's probably way too big is, how do we kind of circumvent that, I guess? Because if we all keep, and I mean, it's even for the European countries, or between European countries with different languages, we usually depend on an English translation to get German translation from the various languages. And I guess my question is just how do we break that circle? How do we get out of that situation where we always need the US language to find stuff for us?
That's a whole panel on its own that you've given us. And it's a very important thing, because one of the things that I'm cognizant of, even when I come in as a quote unquote African writer, is the fact that my knowledge of, and there was a time I was, there's Dante Connection, this fantastic African Italian bookstore that's in Berlin. I remember the first time going there and seeing all these books there and asking myself, I think I'm fairly knowledgeable about African literature, but who are all these guys? And it's because they're translations from Portuguese-speaking Africa and French-speaking Africa that we don't have access to. So if you're sort of like in the Anglophone Africa, Zimbabwe is like next door to Mozambique, but there's very few Mozambican writers that I know, even though they're next door. I know loads of South Africans, Botswanians, Namibians, and that's kind of how we go. And one group that's tried to do this work, again, it's credit to Omenana. There was a time, I'm sure you're aware of this, Peter, that they were actually looking for SFF works from French-speaking Africa to see if they can translate and do something about that. But we're all still pretty much in our silos, and it's kind of that arrogance of being part of the English-speaking world in which you're like, okay, yeah, this is where the business is happening, and there's very, very little incentive to interact with the world outside of that. Yeah, so I'm in the same silo as you are.
So here's a movie that's a French movie. There's another movie called Le Saillant. I see your question. There's another book called The United States of Africa. It's also in French. There's a book from Algeria called Babolem Sanzal 2048. There's a bunch that are sort of visible that are coming up. If you want more titles, come to me afterwards and I'll hand it to you. There's another question.
I just wanted to ask, as a filmmaker, what would you? I'm a filmmaker, and I'm asking you, what would you like? How would you like to see your film version of your novels? Who should be in charge of writing, transcribing it to a screen?
Adapting it.
Yeah, to a script, and who should be like the person directing it? Because you said these labels, like AfroSF, yeah, it's like branding for the white market. When you're in Zimbabwe, it's no longer like AfroSF.
Yeah.
European futurism, maybe. Yeah, but I was just curious.
So there's a guy signing, signaling that we have to. Our night is done, so maybe that's
I'll just do this quickly.
Yeah,
And then, on that, I'm at least one of those authors that are like, that is a completely different skill set. And therefore, even though I'm pretty knowledgeable about, prose and doing that, even when it comes to my book covers, I defer to the designers and the artists that do that. And I'm pretty much the same when it comes to film, that it is an area outside of my, I would never try to tamper with my own work for that. I would want someone else's stamp on it. But I would be open to trying to do a script or something from someone else's work. And so I would be, pretty hands off if the moment does come, and just let them do their thing and what they feel is right. Because I think if you interfere too much with the work, you kind of limit the input of the person who's trying to turn it into something on screen, which should be different from what is on the page. So I'm easy with that. But thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This was really great, and I thank you so much. I'm sure all of us have many more questions. I would like to know what you would take in your backpack when there's an apocalypse, but maybe there's time for a beer and more chat later on. Thank you all.